Welcome back to History with Tim. In part one, we explored the roots of the Irish Civil War, the political divisions, ideological battles, and personal rivalries that tore a newly independent nation apart. Now, in this part two, we will be discussing the conflict unleashed. We dive into the brutal reality of the war itself, from the fierce fighting in Dublin to the guerrilla warfare in the countryside. We'll see how the conflict escalated into a deadly struggle that engulfed all of Ireland. Key figures who once stood together shoulder to shoulder now faced each other across the battlefield. Their visions of Ireland's future clashing in tragic cycle of violence. We'll uncover tactics, battles, and the human costs of this war. And then in part three, we're going to be discussing the aftermath and so on. But thank you so much for joining me today, friends. I really hope you enjoyed the last one. Like I said, I'm going to keep these going until I'm in Ireland, which should be next week. Well, this week now, technically. Obviously, I filmed these ahead. But with that said, let's get into it. So as usual, we're going to pick up right from where we stopped last time. I'm going to cut this into thirds. I said I was going to cut it into two parts, but I do a lot of talking and explanation. But that's also kind of why these videos are the way they are. It's supposed to be analyzing what other historians have brought up and adding some things they might have forgotten. But again, the only reason they forgot it is because they themselves are trying to condense it into a short video. Simon's video is only 24 minutes long, 25 tops. My last video was over 30 minutes long, but that's because intro, outro, and also all the pieces I threw in. But with that said, let's get started.
The last chance to avoid civil war evaporated at the end of May 1922. That's because the end of May was when the British got their first look at Collins's constitution, collectively crapped their pants. Everything they'd negotiated in the treaty was gone. The oath to the king, British predominance in defence policy, the separate carve-out for Northern Ireland. From their perspective, Collins had basically gone and written the constitution according to the treaty that he wished he had. And that was just too much for London, especially given the events in Ulster. So we've not had the chance to mention yet, but during those months of rising tensions in the island's south, Northern Ireland had already been boiling over. February had seen a grenade thrown into a Catholic schoolyard, killing 6 children. March, the murder of the...
And this is where we see the roots of the Troubles. Again, to this day, in Northern Ireland, it's Irish Republicans versus Unionist loyalist. It's not what it really is. It's Protestant versus Catholic, and it's it's a wild thing to think that this thing that started with Henry VIII has come all the way into the modern day. Like, today is definitely better than how it used to be, but throwing a grenade into a church, it's even in war, you don't target churches usually. Well, unless it's total war.
McMahon family by policemen. May, the assassination of Unionist MP William J. Twaddle. Collins actually had a hand in fomenting some of this, encouraging IRA units to engage in cross-border raids and carry out assassinations. Today it's thought this was part of a secret strategy to reunite the IRA by making everyone focus on the one issue they could agree on. Possibly, Collins also hoped to destabilise Ulster, so much so that the British administration would collapse, leading to a united Ireland. Unfortunately, his plan was working so well that London was terrified of making any further concessions. When they saw the draft constitution, the Brits were brutal. The provincial government needed to either rewrite it or face a return to open war. And so died any hopes of de Valera's side ever accepting the treaty. The revised constitution was published on June the 16th, the same day Ireland went to the polls. With its sops to the British, it was so incendiary that the election pact between the two sides broke down. That day, pro- and anti-treaty forces stood firmly against one another at the ballot box, both claiming the Sinn Féin label as their own. Before counting had even finished, the IRA had called another convention, one to discuss a return to fighting. Yet the anti-treaty forces remained just as split as before. Unable to reach a decision, the meeting collapsed when Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows stormed out, issuing a cry for Republicans to flock to the occupied forecourts.
And this is where you're going to see finally it's done. It's that there's no, last video I said it, I was like, there's no stopping what's coming. The IRA is of the opinion they don't want their fight to have been for nothing. And at this point, you're going to see a prominent IRA man by the name of Liam Lynch he's going to take command as the new head of the Irish Republican Army.
Or peaceful elements, meanwhile, set up their own headquarters under Commander Liam Lynch. At this stage, then,
I promise you I didn't know that. I actually didn't finish this video yet.
Witnessing extreme fragmentation, not just the split between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty factions, but a further split in the anti-treaty side between moderates and radicals. It's possible this fragmentation might have stopped the worst of the violence if it had been allowed to run its course, that eventually only the few hundred holed up in the four courts would have been willing to take up arms. But we'll never know, because wider events would soon push the anti-treaty moderates back into the radicals' arms. On the evening of June the 22nd, just as the scale of the anti-treaty faction's failure at the ballot box was becoming clear, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson MP stepped out of a cab at his London home. An Irish-born unionist from County Longford, Wilson was also a British war hero who'd been one of the nation's highest-ranked officers in World War I. But that isn't what Reginald Dunn and Joseph Sullivan cared about. Oh no. As they pulled their guns on Wilson, it wasn't his service record flashing through their heads, but his suspected role in egging on anti-Catholic violence in Ulster. The killing of Wilson and the shooting of two policemen as Dunn and O'Sullivan attempted to escape sent British-Irish relations from tense to...
And it's going to be this moment that you see that the English say, your choice. It's either you side with us in the treaty or it's war. This is an officer of the crown. You know, one of the most amazing things of the 20th century, to be completely honest, was the killing of Lord Mountbatten by the IRA at his estate in Ireland by the IRA. There was people thought the reprisals were going to be insane, which there were reprisals, but this is a war hero, this is a symbol, and it's also an Irish symbol. The Ulster people are going to be like, this guy was a Protestant, native-born Irishman that they just murdered. So it's just this continuous building, and now you have the English that are finally like, no, enough. They're like, we gave you the chance, we gave you the time, and all you did was screw around. Enough. You make your choice, and you sleep with it. And that's where we're about to move into.
Well, nuclear. Certain the assassination was directed from four courts, Winston Churchill demanded Collins storm the building. Failing that, the Brits were going to do it themselves. Yet Churchill would never have to see through his threat because anti-treaty forces were about to force Collins' hand. On June the 26th, the IRA kidnapped the Deputy Chief of Staff of Ireland's new National Army in retaliation for the arrest of an anti-treaty leader. The next day, the Provisional Government held a crisis meeting to decide its response. Not that there was going to be much to decide. As Arthur Griffith put it, we have either to go in or to abdicate. And so the stage was set for an assault on the four courts, an assault now destined to spark the Irish Civil War.
What's heartbreaking about this scene, too, is the fact that they brought in 18-pounders. The Irish Free State Army were using British artillery, guns, armored vehicles, everything. But what was heartbreaking was this mirrors exactly what happened on 1916. This looks just like the Easter Rising, except now it's Irishmen killing Irishmen. And that's what makes it that much more heartbreaking.
It began with a single shell, fired from an 18-pounder, borrowed from the British at 4 a.m. on June the 28th, 1922, arcing through the air before hitting the four courts with a muffled boom. That precise moment, as civil war erupted, it was not clear who would win. The pro-treaty forces had by now been organised into the National Army, an 8,000-strong force with access to British guns and armoured cars. But while they held a powerful weaponry advantage, much of their force was made up of new recruits. Aside from a small number drawn from the IRA units loyal to Collins, many were untrained. The anti-treaty Republicans, by contrast, could field almost 13,000 men. 13,000 had been battle-hardened by the War of Independence. They might only be armed with a few thousand rifles, but, boy, did they know how to use them. For a week after the first shell hit the four courts, Dublin found itself at the epicentre of a series of grueling, bloody battles. Amid all the smoke and darkness came flashbulb moments of horror. One was the gigantic explosion on June the 30th, which destroyed the four courts, obliterating centuries of records. Another was the brutal fighting on O'Connell Street. Another, the bloody death of anti-treaty leader Cathal Brugha.
So his name was Brugha. It wasn't Brugha. Brugha is obviously Simon's English pronunciation of it. Cathobro was actually a political, I don't want to say enemy, antagonist to Michael Collins most of the War of Independence. He had fought during the Easter Rising, much like all these other guys. His death really strikes the anti-treaty forces, because this is a guy, he's been the whole way through. He was, a member of the IRB. He was a member of Sinn Féin. He was a member of the provisional government. He now is a leader of the anti-treaty forces. And this shakes them down to the core, and it makes them realize, oh, it's not going to be, we're doing this because we have to. It's, we're doing this to get rid of you. This is a legitimate war now. And that really reverberates through the anti-treaty IRA.
Gunned down outside the Granville Hotel. But by the time the fog of war cleared on July the 5th, over 300 people were dead in the Irish capital, nearly all of them civilians. But the first major victory had been won. Dublin was fully in the provincial.
And this is the reality of the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. And honestly, when you think about war in general, the people who suffer the most are the population. Dublin is now, in less than 20 years, been a battleground for everything. From 1916 to the attack of the Four Courts, to the 12 Apostle ambushes across the city on British detectives and government leaders, to the Croke Park massacre, to now this. Dublin has been a battlefield consistently. And it's just horrible that the poor citizens, the Dubliners, are the ones that have to suffer through it.
Government's hands. Now, the real fighting could begin. Despite their occupation of Four Courts, the anti-treaty forces had never been popular in the capital. Now, as they retreated from Dublin, they concentrated their fire.
And that's exactly for what I just said. It's the people of Dublin, like I said before in my other video, I believe, I described what the differences were, how the North and East were more like the North during the American Civil War, and the South and West were like the South. There's more people in the North and East, and they're sick of this. They're sick and tired of the fighting. They're sick and tired of the dying. They just want it to end. And they're blaming the anti-treaty forces, being like, we have an option that we get some of what we want, and we can just plan out for the future. Can we just take advantage of this? And then you have the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA, who, with all due respect, they're making valid points that they're like, what is it all worth if we don't get free and full independence? But the issue is, there's such a fatigue of conflict in Ireland. I mentioned this in a few videos ago about Michael Collins' death. Michael Collins dies in an attempt to get the gun taken out of Irish politics. And it's just heartbreaking that it's always the same people who suffer just because of two ideologies not jiving with one another.
Power in the areas where they had the most local support, the southwestern province of Munster. With the death and capture of so many leaders at Four Courts, command of anti-treaty forces fell to Liam Lynch, who'd ditched his moderate stance as soon as fighting broke out. His plan was to take control of cities between Waterford and Limerick, drawing a defensible line across Ireland's southwest. Behind this boundary lay the newly declared Munster Republic, with its unofficial capital of Cork, the IRA's base of logistics. Yet despite what some of his more gung-ho commanders pushed for, Lynch had no intentions of trying to expand the Munster Republic's reach. His goal wasn't to overthrow the provincial governments, but fight them to a standstill, leaving Collins no choice but to renegotiate the treaty, which was a very foolish plan.
Yeah, so the Republic of Munster was not a wise idea. Again, you have this mentality. I'm going to do a lot of comparisons to the United States Civil War. The idea is, we'll just last them out. We'll hold them out. In some scenarios, that might work. In this scenario, it's impossible. This isn't even a scenario where Michael Collins, it's like, well, maybe I'll think about that. Maybe we can try that. He goes to President Griffith, who I believe is still alive at this point, and he says, maybe we can negotiate again. Maybe just to stop this bloodshed. No. That's not what's happening. What's happening is you have Winston Churchill saying, you either put this down or I put this down, and to hell with the treaty. And that's what is going on in Dublin. Liam Lynch, De Valera, all of them are in Cork, and they're like, oh yeah, we can last this out. We can take them on. No, because at the end of the day, this is not a war of different ideas anymore. This is a war of destroying the enemy. And unfortunately, the enemy are men that these guys fought. Men and women. Because like I said in my first video, way back when we started the Easter Rising series by Extra History, the IRA was co-ed. There were female and men fighting in the IRA. And the British, yeah, it was cruel what they were doing, but the thing is, the Free State Army, they knew these people. And that's where you'll actually start seeing the IRA covering their faces more, because they don't want to be recognized, because they know these guys know who they are.
And since Collins absolutely intended to crush Lynch's rebels, the moment the Battle of Dublin was won, the provincial government instituted a shake-up of the National Army. A new call to arms was published, desperately trying to draw in new recruits. While most of them would be untrained, the call did manage to entice in a brand new officer class, one that had spent World War I fighting in the British Army and were experts in full-scale conflict. Likewise, the National Army's command was restructured, placing Collins at the head of a three-man war council alongside Richard Mulcahy and Éanna Duffy. The stage then set, the fighting began. The first engagements took place in the handful of towns outside Munster that Republicans managed to seize. Cut off from backup, IRA units in places like Wexford and Sligo were quickly overrun. Not that this really bothered Lynch. The big test would be what happens when the National Army advanced on his defensive line. The earliest Munster combat came in the city of Limerick.
I'm also from Limerick, so that's kind of fun. But what we're seeing now is the Irish have always survived off the goodwill of not only the other Irish, but also groups like the Church, the United States, things like that. The anti-treaty IRA aren't being supported like that anymore. This is the first time they are on their own, and now you have the Free State Army who are being given everything they ask for. Even officers, trained officers who can whip their soldiers into shape. This is what's catastrophic for Lynch. And Limerick, Limerick is a big city in the west of Ireland. So with the fall of that, now what you're doing is you're dividing these pockets of IRA across the country that the Free State can just surround them and crush them. And Lynch, again, he's in Munster. He's out of his mind. Munster is the southernmost province. That's where Cork is. He's in Cork and he's watching this happen, and he's like, well, our defensive line's still standing, so we're good. But the thing is, his little pockets of troops are collapsing in on themselves because they're being surrounded and caught.
At the beginning of July, IRA forces tried to evict the Free State troops stationed there, only for Lynch to stop the attack at the last moment. The local garrison, you see, was under the control of an old friend, and Lynch was so confident of the rightness of his cause that he hoped to get that friend to side with him. So instead of fighting the National Army in Limerick, he cut a deal. They would occupy different parts of the city and swear not to attack each other. And it's here that we see the biggest problem with the Republican cause in the Civil War. The lack of realism. Not being idiots, the Limerick Free State forces agreed to the deal. Then they waited until fresh reinforcements arrived from Dublin, until their weapons and supplies had been replenished. Finally, on July the 11th, they informed Lynch that the truce had been cancelled. The war for Munster was on.
And there's Michael Collins. We're going to finish this section, and then we're going to finish the next tomorrow. But let's discuss what he just talked about. Lynch was working off goodwill. His mentality was, this guy's my friend, so he's going to have my back. The guy at first was like, oh yeah, of course. Yeah, no, we'll just section off the city. We don't have to shoot each other. We don't have to kill each other. But what really happened? He wasn't being his friend. He was waiting. There's Pemberton. Not Pemberton. It was who was holding Fort Donelson, was a friend of Grant's that actually lent Grant money during tough times before the Civil War. And he was hoping he could use that goodwill with Grant to save his army and himself. But Grant was like, no. But Grant also had the superior forces at that time. This situation, Lynch was definitely not in a good position. But the thing was, the Free State didn't want to have to fight through Limerick the way they did through Dublin. So they just waited it out, and they ended up being successful. Now let's get into what happens to Michael Collins.
In the end, the truly active phase of the Civil War, the phase marked by heavy fighting for key cities, lasted a little over a month. In that short span of time, the anti-treaty forces went from guys with a decentish chance of winning to failures not holding a single slice of territory. At the heart of this shocking collapse lay three major issues: an unwillingness to go on the offensive, a lack of preparation, and a lack of local support in even the most die-hard Republican areas. The first one, lack of offensive action, makes sense when you think about it. Despite whipping the British in the War of Independence, the IRA weren't used to being a regular army, holding lines and capturing territory. They were used to guerrilla tactics, to ambushes.
Hence the name Flying Columns, because they weren't meant to be an occupation force. They were meant to be strike forces, retreat, strike, retreat, strike, retreat. They were supposed to be antagonistic to the British, not hold positions. That's, I said that, I believe, yesterday in the video discussing, oh, you want us to have full-scale engagements? What, like 1916, singing and marching into slaughter? The Irish knew that wasn't the way to fight, but this was a new kind of fighting because they were trying to hold these cities for the anti-treaty forces. But the Free State, again, they're being funded, they're being supplied. The anti-treaty are not. Even the Catholic Church is on the Free State side, because at the end of the day, the church doesn't want people to die. And this is the clearest way to a peaceful resolution. And and many anti-treaty IRA get excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Assassinations and the slow draining of an opponent's strength. So when they suddenly found themselves fighting to hold frontline cities, it's perhaps no surprise that they underperformed. Hence the fall of Waterford on July the 20th, after 2 days of shelling. Hence the surrender of Limerick to the National Army, just a day later. Yet, it would be the lack of preparation that really caused the Munster Republic to collapse. Aware the provisional government might attempt amphibious landings, the leadership had select coastal cities garrisoned. But it was a half-assed effort at best, so when the seaborne attack did come, the National Army were able to land at Cork and in County Kerry with minimal resistance. The result was some 500 Free State troops attacking Tralee from the...
And this is the other genius behind the Free State's tactics. During the War of Independence, they didn't have a navy. They didn't have anything to use against the British. Now, their tactic is pretty much corner the IRA in regions and then use their navy to come around and land troops behind them so they can just crush into them. It's a very scary and quick strategy of divide and conquer. It's, you have a pocket here in Tralee, you have a pocket here in Waterford. Let's take out Waterford. With Waterford taken, now there's a front on Tralee, and now we bring our navy around, land guys behind them, and now we have them from behind, and they're trapped. This is something, and the only reason this wasn't as successful in a place like Cork is just because Cork's massive. Cork is the biggest county. It goes Cork, and then it goes Mayo. Cork is gigantic, so you can land troops in places like Queenstown, which is today Cobh. You could land troops in Cork City, but the countryside is so massive that you need it to be a full offensive. It cannot just be what they're doing in Limerick and Waterford and Tralee. It has to be, we need all forces concentrated on Cork.
On August the 2nd, a prelude to a far bigger amphibious assault that took place on August the 8th. On that day, 200 troops were landed at the small town of Youghal and 180 at the fishing village of Union Hall. From there, they began a march towards Cork, just as 500 soldiers were coming on shore at Passage West outside the city. And that brings us to our final issue, the lack of public support. Although the IRA were able to make money off the Cork Customs House while they held the city, far too much of their fundraising relied on forced taxation and requisitioning. For what? Back when they'd been fighting the British, there had been a sense that the war was for something. Now it seemed like killing and destruction had returned to Ireland, and all over some abstract point few civilians could really get worked up over. And without the population to hold their backs, the Republicans couldn't hope to win. Cork fell on August the 10th, brought down by the heavy weaponry the Free State had been gifted by the British. As the IRA left, they blew up rail lines and blocked roads, a tactic that stopped the National Army from running them down but pissed off locals to a whole new level. It was in the
Okay, so we're gonna stop there because we're getting very close to the end of this story. But just like I said, yeah, they took. You can take Cork City, you can take Queenstown or Cobb, you can take Limerick, you can take Galway, but Cork is gigantic, and that's where Lynch is gonna have this last stand of the anti-treaty IRA. They're going to try to last as long as they can against the oncoming forces of the Free State. And unfortunately, that's where we're going to see Michael Collins' last stand as well. But before we get into that in tomorrow's episode, thank you so much for joining me today, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're learning something new. This is a very lost subject, and again, it's kind of because the Irish don't like talking about it. Because, like you see here, the population was furious. They didn't want this to happen. They were exhausted from the War of Independence, and the best way to compare it is pretty much they are treating the Free State soldiers, the anti-treaty soldiers, the same way that the citizens of Dublin treated the Easter Rising rebels initially when the surrender happened. They are just exhausted and they're sick and tired of the bloodshed. But with that said, thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed what you see, please join our Patreon. We have our 5-tier system: private, captain, sergeant, colonel, and join my Imperial staff as a marshal. Also, if you want to help preserve these battlefields around not only the United States but the world itself, please donate to the History with Tim's National Preservation Fund. We thank you so much for all your help. Please like, share, and comment. If you're new to the channel or if you're returning to the channel, please hit that red subscribe button, hit the bell to stay up to date with all of our new and upcoming content. And with that said, we will see you in the next one.